Hi, everybody who is tuning in. We're really excited to be with you today. And thank you for joining us for the Storytelling and Social Change panel as part of CRAFT at Chatham University's Food in Uncertain Times Conference. A lot of awesome conversations have already happened today, so I'm really excited to keep it going. But before we get started, I just really quickly wanted to shout out all the Eden Hall Fellows who put this beautiful conference together because of their very hard work. The past 2 days have been full of really important conversations and educational moments, and the work that went into that is super duper appreciated. I'm Meg Fair. I am your moderator for this conversation. I am a journalist based out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I've worked for WESA, the city paper, and the Pittsburgh Current, primarily covering culture, LGBTQ life, food, and labor issues. I am super excited for this panel because this panel centers the work of women, gender nonconforming people, Black, Indigenous, and people of color whose work uses storytelling, food, and agriculture to build networks of support and strengthen the ties between community and social change. The work and expertise of these panelists you see are so incredible, and they are doing this work that is strengthening communities across the food system. So we are very excited to have them here today. Just as a little bit of background, stories allow us to share the knowledge from our lived experience. When given an opportunity to shape our own narratives, we can change the way that history is recorded. Food is a vessel for these narratives, and storytelling through food and agriculture is an art, a cultural practice, and a crucial source of empowerment that defies sources of inequity, which have long taken hold on our food systems. Giving the floor to people who are not often upheld or given the floor is super important because those voices are, and their experiences and goals and accomplishments and celebrations and hardships in the system that we live under are too often ignored and undervalued and have incredible value that we can all learn from. So listening to, respecting, and supporting these communities and narratives is essential to everyone's survival. Food has always been tied to social change and revolution. Beginning in 1969 through the early 70s, the Black Panthers' free breakfast for school children program fed literally tens of thousands of kids. And this work laid the groundwork for why we have free federal breakfast programs that exist across the country today. In 2016, the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation's network of camped out protesters gave way to a vast collection of camp kitchens that were serving free food, some of which represented a myriad of Indigenous traditions. As uprisings began in cities across the US this summer, you probably saw all sorts of pop-up barbecues and potlucks and picnics. And those were to keep protesters and regular people fed and hydrated. In the experience that we're living through with COVID and food shortages and, times are really hard, we've seen the appearance of free food fridges and cabinets and pantries popping up in communities. And these are just a few examples of the ways that food and resistance are intertwined. And each of the panelists here today have their own experience to share about the ways that food, agriculture, and storytelling fuse together to foster survival, community, and social action, as well as uphold cultural traditions. And I have said plenty, so now I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. Let's start with Zaheer.
Hi, everyone. So honored to join you on this in this conversation. I'm Zaheer Ali. I'm an oral historian and educator. I've worked as an oral historian for 20 years, and for me, oral history is not just a source of knowledge about the past. It is a means of intergenerational connection and continuity, and a practice for nurturing community through storytelling and listening. Most recently, I was the oral historian at Brooklyn Historical Society for 5 years, where I directed several community-based oral history projects, the most recent one being Muslims in Brooklyn, which was a multi-year oral history-based project, an art installation, curriculum development, and community gathering project. Currently, I am the history editor at Sapelo Square, which is an online resource on Black Muslims in the United States. And I'm primarily working to leverage the power of American Muslim storytelling for social and cultural change as a senior fellow at the Pillars Fund and as an Open Society Foundation Soros Equality Fellow.
Meg, I think your mic is off. I'm not sure. Okay, I'm gonna go next. That's what she said. Okay. Hi, I'm Tatiana. I am also known as the Kitchen Witch Bitch. That's my little business Instagram handle. But yeah, so I am a Black and Indigenous, mostly self-taught chef, very small time business owner. I primarily do pop-ups. I was doing wholesale for a couple cafes here in Pittsburgh. That's where I'm currently based. I'm from New York City. Originally, I've been here for 5 years. And my journey with food really started once I moved out here. I'd been cooking for myself for a little while, but learned a lot from my mom. So I'm partially taught through things I learned from my mother, things I've learned through the internet, and things that are just like instinctually there. So I'm very happy to be doing this talk, and excited to hear, I think, everyone's perspectives about Zaheer speaking about like the history of food, but then also, you know, having like these really great diverse minds that have different connections with food, especially like through culture and like very close like cultural tyings to food. But yeah, I also do, I do use my kitchen and food and plants to aid in my witchcraft. I am a self-taught bruja that specializes in kitchen and green magic. So primarily working with plants and working with things that are found in the kitchen, which to me was like the most accessible and affordable way, because witchcraft can be, and food in general, cooking and witchcraft go very much hand in hand, with the fact that they can be intimidating and seem expensive, but they really don't have to be. And when you can form your own special DIY relationships with them, it hits a lot closer to home. But yeah, that's, hello, happy to be here.
All right, Shani.
Hi, friends. My name is Shani, and I am a farmer by trade. So I've been working on farms for the last 8 seasons since I was a late teenager. And in the last couple of years, I founded an organization called the Jewish Farmer Network, which is an organization that works to mobilize Jewish wisdom to build a more just and regenerative food system for all. And we connect current and aspiring Jewish farmers to peers, mentors, opportunities, histories, and Jewish texts to allow them to build a strong and meaningful connection between their vocation and their tradition. And a lot of my work has to do with undoing stories and breathing new life into old stories to find their relevancy in the modern moment and to our modern work. And I'm really excited to be on this panel because something that I talk about a lot is that all wisdom traditions have so much to share about how to be in right relationship with the earth. And I think the best thing we can do is to like be in conversation with each other and find ways to like share and create regenerative relationships with each other that enable regenerative relationships with the earth. So grateful to be on this panel with y'all.
And Andi.
Hi, my name is Andi Murphy. I am a podcaster. My podcast is called Toasted Sister Podcast, and it's all about Indigenous food. So going on almost 4 years now. So I've talked to literally dozens of Native chefs and farmers and people who are working in this Native food movement to revitalize food, to create access to food, to promote Indigenous food knowledge. I am Navajo from the Navajo Reservation, but I currently live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I'm also a producer for Native America Calling, which is the only live 1-hour radio show about Indigenous issues and topics. So my life is telling Native stories and telling it for radio, telling it for audio. And I also do podcasting, I do photography, I do freelance writing, but mostly all that extra stuff after work is all about food. So I love talking about food every single day. Wish I could do it all day, every day, but I have to have a little bit of variety with my full-time job. But, with my full-time job as a producer for Native American Calling, like I'm talking to Native professors and educators and artists and movers and shakers and activists and people who are, on the ground, creating community movements in their tribe, in their state, across the country. So I'm a Native journalist. I've been a Native journalist for about a decade now. So happy to be here.
So excited to have all of you here. Just to kind of frame the conversation, get it started. Obviously, all of us know that food can be a vessel for storytelling in some really powerful ways. And Zaheer, as an oral historian, you are working closely with this. So could you give us some kind of context, a way to frame the conversation about how food can affect social change?
Yeah, well, I think I come to this as an oral historian, as a listener. And so, but there are many different ways that we listen, right? Listening is not just about the sensory experience of hearing. Listening is about how we understand all of the kinds of information we receive and how we create a place for that information within ourselves. And so I thought about this in terms of how we could listen to food, or a prepared dish, and in what are the kinds of stories that an actual dish could tell us. And so the ingredients in that food tell us about the relationship that people have to the land, right? Oftentimes the ingredients can tell us where people come from, or their place of origin, or their relationship to that land, either as a indigenous relationship, or it could be as a colonized relationship, right? The way that those ingredients are prepared tell us something about the customs and practices, how, for example, in certain cultures, meat is washed and seasoned, and maybe not in other cultures, right? The labor that is used in this whole process of gathering, preparing, in serving, in consuming. This tells us how we organize our communities. And in that, of course, include gender roles and how we understand the roles that people play in terms of assigning gender. Meals are rituals of consumption, and they tell us how we create space for social interaction. And so coming out of that, the materials and equipment that we used become archival objects and artifacts that carry these stories, right? These stories are encoded in these objects. For example, I think one of the most popular ones I know in my family is a seasoned iron pot that has been handed down, because, like the older the pot is, in terms of iron, the better the food tastes in it, for baking cornbread or frying chicken. And then also another way of encoding these stories are the recipes, right? Whether they are written recipes or orally transmitted recipes. In recipes are, sort of spaces where there is a transmission, often intergenerationally, of wisdom. And so, that's just for me how I think about the ways that I could incorporate food in an oral history practice of listening. And I'll just give one quick example. My work on primarily with African-American Muslims and African-American Muslim storytelling, that has helped shape my understanding of how, food can tell this story. Because food practices have been central to the construction of African-American Muslim identity and community, not just as a sacred obligation, the prohibition against eating pork or consuming alcohol, but that these food practices take on other kinds of important functions and significance. So in terms of dietary, nutritional, or health stories or health narratives, in the ways that people are taking control of their health, in terms of cultural self-determination. So the prohibition against eating pork, while it may originate out of scripture, it also becomes an important story about rejecting what people consider a slave diet or a slave legacy, and sort of fashioning a new kind of cultural identity. these food practices also are an important aspect of projects of economic self-determination. When you talk about food autonomy, the controlling the sites and means of production, and also providing distribution of that food, and cultivating community through, again, the cooperative labor in the production of food, the shared experience in ritual abstinence in the form of fasting, and then, of course, breaking the fast with a community meal. These are all important forms of socializing, especially in the early 40s and 50s and even 60s for these communities where the sort of popular forms of entertainment were shunned, especially when those popular forms of entertainment encoded deeply white, anti-Black messages, right? And so in terms of, if you say like, well, we're not going to go to the movies, we're not going to watch Hollywood, what are we going to do for our socializing? So gathering for meals became really important. And so the sites where these meals were consumed, whether they were in people's homes, and so there's a whole tradition of hosting that comes out of that, or even in local restaurants. So oftentimes the restaurants were located on the first floor and the second floor was the mosque. And so very much in the tradition of the church, where people would sort of end their church service and then go into the church basement for the Sunday dinner, similar kinds of practices that happen. And then finally, and I alluded to this before, the gender roles, right? So clearly, well, not maybe clearly, but there were very clear, distinct gender roles that were practiced or prescribed in these communities. But even within that, men and women often work together, especially in terms of public food production, not so much in the home, but in terms of working at bakeries or restaurants, and they shared the different kinds of labor. And so there was a kind of equality of labor in those experiences. And even in where, this sort of cult of domesticity may have prescribed specific roles for women as food preparers, for many of these women, they sort of took that experience as a means by which they could be the actual community designers and cultural shapers of the communities. They would alter recipes with their own twist. They would be the ones that gathered the community together and would oftentimes be the mediators of conversation or of conflict through their food practices. And so for many women who were part of these movements, it wasn't in any means a sort of, I'm stuck in the kitchen, making food. It was very much more than that. And so that's just an example of the ways that I've engaged in oral histories with communities, where food has been very central in understanding and unpacking how these dynamics work and function in these communities.
Absolutely. And I think you bringing up the fact that so much of this, community building and gathering have to do with physical gathering in person. And obviously this year, things have changed greatly, and it's much harder and it's less safe to get together. And it's completely changed the way we connect over food and has affected so many food systems. And Andi, through both your podcast and your work at Native America Calling, I'm kind of curious from your perspective, how are the current circumstances shaping the way that you tell stories about food, and what food stories are you telling now or discovering now?
Yeah. Well, obviously with COVID-19, we're just doing all kinds of how Native Americans are affected by COVID-19. It seems like every week at Native America Calling is a whole different subject about how sports in Native America is being affected, how food is being affected, politics, like everything, voting, everything is being affected by COVID-19. So we've really, upped our coverage of how Native Americans are dealing with it and how they're finding ways to, come out on the other end of it. There's still a lot of struggle because we still haven't been a full year in pandemic mode, which is hard to believe. So that's kind of, how we've switched gears and how everybody switched gears and started focusing on COVID-19. And then, for my podcast, it's harder to connect with people. I have to do it technical, different, all kinds of different ways, whatever access people have to uh, audio, technology and stuff like that. But I've produced an episode that is all about how Native chefs and farmers are affected by COVID-19, and it's all across the board, from a Native chef who was laid off from her job, an entrepreneur who had to close her doors, and find other ways of making do, and then on a tribal level, like tribes having to move money around and make sure everybody's still employed. Now it's been a couple months, and there are stories now coming out about people not getting paid, or like being permanently laid off after the tribe had just exhausted all their funds. And in terms of food, it's kind of a silver lining in this COVID-19. Everybody's paying a lot of attention to growing food where it comes from. I think I've seen a lot of people putting in gardens for the first time and harvesting for the first time, and then tribes, directing their COVID-19 assistance money to farming projects and community gardens and stuff like that. So that's kind of the silver lining. Also, chefs who have catering businesses or were in restaurants, they kind of had the time to be unemployed, and then just kind of think about what they really want to do, about their own personal connections to indigenous food and how they want to use that knowledge to help their own communities. So that's like the silver lining of everything, besides what you hear in mainstream media, which is all the Indians are starving, you guys. They're starving. We should help them. So, that's kind of the mainstream media coverage of Native American food right now. But just being on the ground, being from the community, I know there are other stories. I know we're struggling. I know, all the health disparities. I know that. I live it. I came from it. So, from my perspective and Native journalist perspective, we know what else is going on. We know like all the cool things that people are doing in our communities to address these problems, even if they are on, small scale, small scales. Did I answer your question?
Yes,
Okay.
that's excellent. I think that is so interesting, and we're going to kind of dig in a little bit later into the ideas of being in control of your own narrative, and how if it's your lived experience, you probably have a more clear understanding of the complexities of communities, because no communities are exactly the same or homogenous, and that's like one of the biggest trappings of, I feel like, broad mainstream media is homogenizing entire groups of people. And Shani, I think that something I'm really interested to hear from you about is, you're a farmer and you connect Jewish farmers to each other, which obviously that is going, connecting people is a little bit harder when there's a pandemic. But I'm curious, what have you seen change in the food systems that you work with? And also, what are the stories that are being reported on right now, and what stories do you think perhaps we should be focusing more on?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, I wrote down a bunch of notes about this question, and it's like many different directions. So I'm going to try to like synthesize it in. But something that I was thinking a lot about while Andi was talking was there's this. I'm just like, I've been really inspired with the ways that farmers in our network have pivoted during the pandemic. So there are folks that, we have like friends that are like goat farmers up in Maine, and they like offer free milk to anyone in need, and they leave it on their porch so that it can be like taken in confidence if that's like something that they need. And there's this Jewish agricultural ethic that's called this law of payah, which means that you're supposed to like designate a corner of your field for those in need. And every day in morning prayers, we say, Elu hadvarim she'en lechem shiur. These are the things for which there are no limit. And you like list like a couple of like deeds to which there is no upper limit. And one of those is payah. One of those is the amount of like this corner that you're designating for those in need. There's no limit. You can make it your whole field. So a lot of farms in our network have pivoted fully to offering everything for donation. So where I was stewarding land in North Carolina in the summer on ancestral Cherokee land, we were growing fully to support like the Latinx community in the area that was like totally like disproportionately affected by COVID in that moment. So it's like a huge pivot that we've seen happening. And then we also have some like farm camps in our system that like they don't have kids at camp, and like most of the reason why they have a farm at camp is for educational opportunities. And instead of just being like, okay, no kids, like we're not gonna do anything, like they paid to keep their farmers on to be able to grow, to be able to support those in need, and to be able to like grow some extra produce and get people some healthy produce when they need it. And I think that like being able to ground those actions in ancient wisdom, in these ideas, is like so, for me, like in terms of like narratives and stories, is like so reparative and so healing. It's like, oh, like this is something that our people did, like let's continue that onward, and let's like connect through our ancestors in that way. And yeah, so, and something else that's like really blown my mind during the pandemic is there's a farmer in our network named Mink who started this project called the Cooperative Gardens Commission, where it's like hundreds of people were on these calls. He was big in the Occupy movement also. And this was really collaboratively run thing where people can connect with each other and say, hey, I have seeds, who needs seeds? And they've created seed hubs throughout the country in order to get resources to those who need it in order to get growing. Like Andi was saying, a lot of people are getting growing during this pandemic, but a lot of people also just didn't know where to start. And so there was a lot of like rethinking of like, what are the resources that we have available? And like, maybe that's seeds, maybe it's knowledge. So how can we connect people who know how to grow with people who want to grow, but maybe need a little bit of help? So that's like just rethinking what's a resource. And then something that I've been thinking a lot about with that is like this, like the idea of like land resources. And when I think about what sort of resources the Jewish community in this country has, like I reflect a lot on like, we have, hundreds of thousands of acres on like lawns of synagogues and lawns of Jewish day schools and sleepaway camps and like all of these places that like, they're just sitting empty. And like how, like my question going forward in the pandemic is like, how can we rethink those resources and pivot them to be able to support those that want to get growing, both from within our community and outside of our community, because that's like an amazing resource. And there's also this Jewish idea of Shemitah, which is that every 7 years we let the land rest, we take the fences down and everything becomes communal. And next year, Rosh Hashanah, so next fall, we're going to be entering into the Shemitah year. So what will it look like for us to take down our fences and to offer up this land as a commons and as like a communal space? And then the last thing, I just want to answer the other part of your question, which is how are we gathering people in the times of COVID? We have really, really leaned into online gathering. We have the Jewish Farmer Network has monthly community calls. We just actually had one last night. And we've been doing a lot more online classes for folks to kind of dig into what does it mean to be Jewish land stewards in this world. And yeah, just digging in together. So thanks.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting because every person probably watching this and as part of this panel has had to pivot the way you do your work. And I think that the digital sphere, and obviously we have to consider access to internet and access to high-speed internet, because I have been on a Zoom call while in rural Northeast Ohio, and it is not great quality because there's just not good internet when you don't have access to it. So I think that it is really important to recognize that, but I also think that people who tell stories through digital means probably have, you know, a unique experience in both learning and sharing. And Tati, I think one of the things about your work is that you are able to connect a lot of people through your Instagram, Kitchen Witch Bitch. And I know that social media has been integral to, you know, your journey, both as a chef and as a connector to people. So I would love to hear how it has shaped your journey.
Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. Social media technology is a big part of my personal relationship with food thus far, and like my ways of learning more about food and teaching myself more about food. Um, yeah, I'm 24, I'm young. I definitely grew up in the age of like cell phones and technology and social media, all that, but I didn't get to really tap into that. My parents were weird and like didn't get me a cell phone until I was like almost 18. I didn't have like social media till, you know, a lot later. So it was around me, but I technically didn't grow up with it, but have been using specifically Instagram as a tool for a very long time now. And right now I have a really complicated relationship with social media, but it is honestly pretty much the only reason that I have some sort of degree in food. And I use the term career lightly because I just feel like I'm just kind of floating around in the realm of food and like haven't really taken like solid steps to being like, yes, I am a chef, you know, but we're getting there. It's fun. It's valid. And it's just been really exciting to get to explore food as something that I love and as a passion, and have that kind of grow and snowball into a business literally through social media. So I began like my journey to get closer to food and know more about food when I became full vegan about, I want to say like 4.5 years ago. I'm not fully plant-based now, but I do still eat primarily a plant-based diet, like everything in my house. The only animal products in my house is usually just honey. Sometimes I'll get eggs that come directly from my friend's hens. I have conflicting views on veganism overall, because I don't know, I just don't think vegans should be convinced that they're saving the world by not eating animals, because there's very sacred ways in which certain cultures respectfully and responsibly consume animals, but that's a whole other thing. So, but yeah, becoming vegan was really encouraging for me to learn so much more about food, which was very much nurtured through the internet, because I grew up in a Guatemalan, Salvadoran, and Haitian household. Veganism was like not really a thing in most of those cultures, at least not in a major way up until recently. So I grew up with a mom, like I became vegetarian when I was very young. My mom was very accommodating to that, always had, you know, vegetable sides and like non-meat things. But it was a lot to learn about being full vegan from never having really much exposure to that. So, you know, largely thank the internet for that. But yeah, so I tied that in with things that I had learned from my mom, that she had learned from her mom, and just kind of mashed it in with the things that I was learning about vegan cooking and how I could make things that I grew up eating that were very traditional through my mom, through like the matriarch of my family, because my mom very much was like, you know, the cooker of the family. Speaking of like gender roles, like, you know, I did grow up in a household where my mom was the one cooking. So I did learn things from her. But tying that with things that I was learning about veganism, so that, you know, thank goodness for the internet for that, because I feel like I have so much knowledge and interest in food that came solely from that. But yeah, I just started this page, Kitchen Witch Bitch, on Instagram, just as a little hobby documentary sort of thing, just like a food diary almost. And then just started getting really passionate about it, was cooking like way more often and was making things that just like looked nice, and then was hugely surprised by like the response that got. I think largely through my other platforms, because I am a musician, I do photography and modeling and stuff like that, so had a presence elsewhere in the realm of Instagram, was able to transfer some of that over to Kitchen Witch Bitch, but also make friends and connections solely through that. And then started getting opportunities to do pop-ups. My best friend Corinne worked for a business called Small Mall here in Pittsburgh at the time. She was the concept facilitator there. And Small Mall's a great shop if you live in Pittsburgh, or I think they have like an online shop. They sell only local Pittsburgh artists' work, which is super cool. They were the first people to give me an opportunity to do a pop-up. And I was just like so blown away by the support that that first one got. And then my good friend Sadie runs a local vintage and like art shop called Three Pigs Vintage, and she was the person to give me my second opportunity, and then just like was able to get more things through there. But it's just been beautiful to work with my friends, but then also have people come and show up and be like, I've just have been following your kitchen page since you started it, and like I've been wanting to try your food. So it's just really been beautiful to see the ways that Instagram was the way for me to start a business or some sort of career in food, because it just wasn't something that I was really anticipating. So it's just been really nice to have that support for sure. Yeah, I'm very, very grateful for the internet for that reason, because Instagram can be so overwhelming and exhausting, especially now. I just recently deactivated my main Instagram. It's just been so much, but it's not lost on me that I have found so much community in food, in music, in storytelling, and the ways in which like I get really flowery with my captions. Sometimes I'm like, why am I waxing poetic on Instagram? Like no one gives a damn, but people will read it and they care so much. And then you have these, beautiful, profound conversations with strangers online, or you get closer to people you already know. And then, yeah, with COVID, it's weird because I haven't been able to do a pop-up since earlier this year. So I do miss that a lot, but I've been trying to find the ways to use, I've been a little tapped out online. I've been a little bit over it, but I do want to, taking a step away from it personally, it'd be nice to focus more on like the cooking page and be able to share more about like brujeria and things that I've been learning through like quarantine and stuff like that in this year in general, because it has been an extremely transformative year and like very much a focal point on not only physical health with the pandemic going on, but mental health and emotional health, like of sitting stagnant inside for so long, and the ways in which we need to tell each other stories and connect through Instagram. So it has been very helpful for that, even in such a weird, frustrating year for so many people. But there's a lot to be grateful for about it. So
yeah, I think that one of the things about your Instagram that I have always appreciated, and I think it's something that is part of social change and storytelling, is that you are in the driver's seat of sharing your story and your own narrative. And I think that there's so much power and there's so much emphasis on the stories that, we tell ourselves, that are the stories that get told in our own communities, the way that we share both our histories and kind of where we want to go. And those are really rich stories, and they're not often what we see in popular media. So I'm going to kind of pick all of your brains about this, but one of the things that I think this panel is exploring is what we can learn from the stories of people around us, be it, physically face-to-face or digitally. And Zaheer, I'm really interested, as you're gathering stories during the pandemic, maybe exploring a little bit about like stories for both strategy and survival, as well as like spiritually nourishing.
Yeah, I think, well, one of the things that I think is important is that so much of the way that the way that we've thought about the pandemic has framed certain populations as vulnerable, and in so doing has sort of portrayed them as burdens or people who are in need of care, and has diminished or really ignored the value that these populations present. And I'm thinking in particularly elders and children, right? Some of us are sandwiched in between elders and children and having to care for both, and it is overwhelming. But I think that if we step back and think about the kinds of stories that both elders and children can tell us, in different ways, they help us move through this moment. In particular, elders, I think, have stories of resilience and survival. The ways that they may have experienced earlier periods of uncertainty when it comes to food. And so the practices of like food preservation or even substitutions of like, you don't have meat, so we're going to have alternative protein sources, or We know that we need to eat a certain amount of carbs for energy during times of low food supply. How to can and preserve food for the long-term storage. These are things that elders really know how to do. And in fact, some of the communities that I have been working with and talking to actually had survival kits. They have like an instruction guide survival kit for experiencing periods of food uncertainty. And so, you know, that's important. The other thing that I think is, and when we talk about stories of survival, is to not diminish stories of loss, right? And, you know, I think oftentimes when we talk about stories of survival, it's all about like, we've made it. And the truth of the matter is everyone didn't make it, right? And so it's important to make space for people who do not survive, and thinking about what their stories can tell us as well, and how to create spaces of memory for people who don't survive, as, you know, not as like a doomsday kind of narrative, but as a real understanding of what is at stake in this moment, because at some point people are going to tell their coronavirus stories. And you know, I hope that we don't be, you know, I hope no one is ever like, oh, we survived that. Well, at least 250,000 people in this country did not, and probably even more who have, you know, lingering effects of the disease, and and then people on the periphery who have not maybe suffered, you know, from the disease itself, but from the fallout from the disease in terms of other kinds of economic insecurity and hardship, and educational interruption, all of those kinds of things, right? So I think it's important when we talk about survival that we don't diminish loss and its significance. And then the last thing I'll say, and the other thing, so our stories should not be sources of nostalgia, but engines of transformation. It's not about how things used to be, but how we changed the way things were. And I think that that is important to get from the stories of people who have moved through earlier forms of disaster, or, you know, epidemics or pandemics. I mean, even talking to people from the 80s who went through like almost a triple crisis of HIV, AIDS, crack, and mass incarceration, right? And again, that's where you understand that stories of survival do not exclude stories of loss. And then the last thing I'll say is, we often think that, you know, you have to have lived for a period of time before you have stories to tell. And I think that children have important stories to tell us. They have an important lens to tell us. And they often can be, you know, for people familiar with the now very famous essay that Arundhati Roy wrote, "The Pandemic is a Portal," children can often provide the imagination that help us understand where the portals are, because they're not saddled down yet by all of the sort of limitations on the imagination that we are, by having to have moved through the world in the way that we've had to. And I think that children often tell us stories that provide us important doors of possibility. And so, you know, I think that, you know, it's hard to reach out to people and find people to do this storytelling in the ways that I think everyone has talked about, especially Andi, in the ways that it's hard to connect digitally. And so I think about the people who are in your space, even the people who are in your home. Many of us live with people and we haven't even sat down and listened to their stories, right? And I think there's great value there for building even stronger relationships through storytelling within the spaces that we are in.
Absolutely. And Shani, I know that in, you know, a previous passing conversation, we talked about within communities, the stories, you know, that we hear and we get told and we tell ourselves, and the stories that we want to tell. And so I'm kind of curious, especially with Zaheer talking about, you know, listening to children as well as listening to older people, like, how does that feel? What are the stories that like you're hungry for versus the stories that you are used to hearing, I guess?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, there's a lot of like unraveling of stories and breathing new life into old stories. So as a modern Jewish farmer, a lot of things that I hear, so like when folks I had several folks when they see our logo on things on my person, because I'm like highly branded, gotta represent. But I've had Jewish people say to me, "Oh, Jewish farmer, isn't that an oxymoron?" And several times. And I've also had, we have a lot of farmers in our network who, like, when they go home to their families and say, like, "Oh yeah, like I decided I'm gonna go work on this farm," what they hear from their parents and from their grandparents is, "Oh, Jews don't do that. Jews don't farm." And this is like this like pervasive story. And so a lot of my work over the last 4 years has been like getting at the roots of that story and like understanding where it's coming from, and finding like the ways that we can pick it apart. So these are stories that like so I'm an Ashkenazi Jew, meaning that I am from of Eastern European descent. And a lot of this idea of like Jewish weakness or Jews not doing physical labor, doing agriculture, comes from Nazi era anti-Semitic propaganda that says that Jews are weak, that Jews are, if you look at like imagery from that time, like that's a lot of like what was being put out. So it comes from that, and it was told to our great grandparents, or for some of us, our grandparents, and then it was just passed down through the generations to the modern moment. It also comes from this idea of like placelessness. So in a lot of spaces in Eastern Europe, there's also this reality that a lot of Jews in Eastern Europe were not allowed to own land. We weren't allowed to like steward our own land. So this, we're coming from a tradition that is largely agrarian. Our entire flow of time, the way that we move through the world, the way that we move through the seasons, is rooted in the harvest cycles, is rooted in where we are at. Are we resting? Are we celebrating our harvest? Are we like, is it the barley harvest? Is it the wheat harvest? Are we counting the days between the harvest to like savor every moment of it and feel so grateful? And we took that, there's this kind of like idea of like we packaged up that that agrarian life, and we put it in a suitcase, and we kind of been carrying it around the world with us. But in a lot of places where we were carrying that story around with us, we weren't allowed to own land. So we kind of just like pushed that agrarian root of it down. And then we end up with people saying Jewish farmer, isn't that an oxymoron? Now that also does like damage within our community, because like, well, it's doing damage to me as an Ashkenazi person who, like, you know, this was said about my ancestors, and like that weakness was like that stereotype was put on my ancestors. But it also fully erases the identity of Jews that aren't Ashkenazi. So like Moroccan Jews were farming peacefully alongside their Arab neighbors for the past 2,000 years. So when we have this like big open, like Jews don't farm, you're just like fully erasing the diversity within the Jewish community and the diversity of Jewish stories there. So a lot of our work is like saying like no to all of that. Like, yes, Jews are farmers. Something we say often is, before we were the people of the book. So sometimes Jews are referred to as the people of the book, even in sign language. This is one of the signs for a Jewish person. So in people of the book, and before we were the people of the book, we were the people of the land. We used to enact our relationship with the divine through our relationship with the earth. That is how it happened. And in traveling around the world, we've come to this place where on Sukkot, which is a holiday that passed about a month ago, we sit outside and we sit in little huts and we celebrate our harvest. I grew up where we would have plastic grapes and plastic fruits hanging from the ceiling of our sukkah on a harvest festival. What are we doing? That's crazy. So we are in this work of reweaving the stories from way back when and making this full circle. So we've come furthest away, I think, from where we started as a really earth-based tradition, and we got really, really far. And so we're just trying to bring the stories from here back around and make that connection again, so that modern Jewish agrarians don't have to walk around feeling like they're an aberration, feeling like they're an anomaly, feeling like there is nothing in the Jewish tradition or nothing in the Jewish world for them, that they don't belong. No, you do belong. The work that you do is the most Jewish work that you can be doing. This is what our ancestors did. This is who we are at our core. So how can we connect those stories? And so we say, I've recently been saying, I get like little phrases that I throw out, but like we are the A-N-D, that connects their story with the story of the Jewish people. And then just one more point with the stories there, and I really liked what Tati was talking about earlier with social media and like visibility. We use our social media, we use Instagram to celebrate the diversity of the faces and the stories of Jews engaged in agriculture today. Because we really believe in the idea that if you see it, you can be it. So for so much of us, so many of us, wow, for so many of us, like I didn't grow up knowing any Jews that were farmers, because we're a culture that has come to like value intellectual labor over physical labor and has like pushed down this part of our heritage. And so the work of social media in this moment for the next generation of Jewish farmers is saying, here are Jewish people that are farming, and here's a Jewish person who is farming who looks like you. Here's a Black Jewish farmer. Here's a trans Jewish farmer. Here's an Orthodox Jewish farmer. Here are all like, here's a Mizrahi Jewish farmer, a Sephardi Jewish farmer. Like, here are people that look like you, so that when you see it, you know that you can be it. And you know that you can inhabit that role of Jewish agrarian moving forward into the future. I don't even remember what your question is.
that was very beautiful. That was very beautiful. I think that's really powerful, that if you can see it, if you can see it, you can be it. I think that, you know, within storytelling, that's so central, right? Like if we're showing people that they can be stewards of the land, if we're showing people that they can make certain types of food, or they can connect to their community through food, that's so powerful and can really empower people. And Tati, I feel like you were empowered through seeing other people's stories and accessing that on, you know, the internet, and then sharing your own rituals and your own story through food. So I'm curious what you hope you sharing that your story, what that does for other people.
Yeah. So my hope with like really anything I do, with whether it's food or music or drawing or photography, really any of the mediums that I work with, which is a lot. I'm very grateful for all those things. Ultimately, I just hope to create and tell stories of self-care, resistance, reclaiming power, joy, growth, and taking care of community through my food and the food that I share with others, as well as art. Because food is a teacher, and it tells us so much about ourselves, our history, and the world as a whole. And I think that's so beautiful. I would really like to deepen my relationship with my Haitian, Salvadoran, and Guatemalan cultures, especially like as like far back as I could go, which I'm not sure, because I don't have a super, super close relationship with my blood family, but there is just so much there that can be found, yes, through the internet, but also just like people that I could meet through the internet, traveling once traveling is like a safe, responsible thing to do, especially if I would be planning on meeting like indigenous people. Like you don't want to be a colonizer about to go spread disease to people who have remained untouched by it. So, you know, whenever that's possible, traveling and being able to grow a community all over the world from that and learn about myself and my bloodlines and the things that I feel, but I don't know everything about yet. So all of my cultural backgrounds have very spiritual relationships to food. Everything about it is sacred, whether it's the actual propagation of it, how to harvest it, the spirits of the animals that they consume, the stories behind food and ingredients, the gods and the goddesses that are attached to certain foods and ingredients, or certain days and like moon phases of when to harvest what, or just like feeding ancestors through altars and things like that. There's just so much to know and tap into. And I know a little bit, but it's very little. And I'm just very excited by, the fact that there's just so much to learn and so many people to meet through that. And then building that community and relationship, not only with plants and food, but with other people that are doing the same thing and just have the same, passions and feelings about food and plants in general. I just feel that it brings me closer with myself and other people, and just like this such unique and rare way that only you can really get from food and the conversations and the rituals surrounding food. I would also really like to get some formal education in herbalism to deepen my relationship with plants and all the stories they have to tell. Sorry, my neighborhood children are screaming. I would like to know so much more about the medicinal properties of food and plants. It's probably the thing that excites me most and makes me want to keep pursuing a career in this field. I'd like to continue to learn how to heal myself and others with what grows from the earth, like all of my ancestors did. Communicating and working with plants is absolutely a form of magic. It's alchemy, and that to me is so beautiful, especially because it serves as a reminder that we as humans are part of nature, and that nature is meant to transform and evolve, which is a very comforting, soothing thought for me, especially in such chaotic, unpredictable times. I think we're taught to fear change and to reject it, but ultimately the ability to adapt and evolve and persevere is what allows me to be sitting here right now, because my ancestors had to do all of those things to continue to exist when faced with violence and people trying to ratify them. And it's just like, I don't know, it's just kind of nice to sit here. It's nice to cook things that were passed down to me and be like, ha, still here. It's like kind of just like, you know, like a big middle finger to these things that are just are so blatantly in front of us right now, especially this week in the United States, or just this year in general. There's just, we're seeing a violence that's not new in any way, shape, or form, especially not to me or any Black or brown person. So it's been interesting to sit through such a scary, chaotic time, but also have this like calmness to it, and kind of like in the face of so much fear and vulnerability and uncertainty, to kind of sit and be like, you know what? This is not really new to me or mine. And, you know, I would like to do my part to heal the world, to change things, but ultimately, like, the things that are wrong with the world are very much a product of white patriarchy and the violence and the greediness that comes from that. So where I do think we all do have a part to, you know, heal the earth. I do think for Black and brown people, we should be very much looking inward and to each other and being like, hey, like what genuinely brings you joy, and where do you see yourself in your ideal future, instead of like accepting this this doom and this apocalyptic fiery image of the future that we're also like just so like, yeah, okay, like, you know, well, whether it's jokingly or very seriously, like having like preppers, you know, which is a whole other thing with like food and, and scarcity mindset and hoarding and this whole thing. But I think we're also willing to accept like the apocalypse and just like burning in fire. But like what I really want Black and brown people to embrace and accept the fact that we deserve long, full lives, full of health. And if we want to live till we're old and fat and happy and die next to the person we love, like we deserve that. And it's been robbed from us very often. So I want, you know, anyone within my community to really sit and acknowledge those things, especially like as a queer, gender nonconforming person. Like I just like the life expectancy for Black and brown trans people or gender nonconforming people or just queer people in general is very low. So I think forming relationships with the earth, being so dedicated to just being here and like being like almost like stubborn of just like, no, like I deserve to be here and I deserve to like know the earth and have like a full life, whatever that looks like to you. That's just the story I want to tell for myself, and I want that to spread like wildfire, because I've been inspired through social media, seeing people that I very much look up to and have like these like, you know, just like inspiration crushes on people through the internet that I very much identify with and see myself with, whether they're Haitian, Salvadoran, or Guatemalan, or like just have like a ancestral tie to the things that I do, or just work with plants and food and herbalism and witchcraft in the same way that I would like to be. So just hearing and seeing other people doing their things and making their stories and their long, full, beautiful lives. I just want that for myself, and to be able to share that with other people and just keep that going. Like, because we deserve
Absolutely.
it. We deserve it.
Absolutely. And Andi, I think you touched on that right out of the gate, being like, you know, so many of the popular narratives are, you know, when you paint a marginalized community as like victims or whatever, it takes away from the beautiful resistance that's actually happening and the joy that's happening. So from your perspective, I would love to know, like, what are the stories that you're really excited about right now? What is happening in, you know, the realm of Toasted Sister, in that food realm? What is happening that's so exciting to you?
Man, there's kind of a lot of things that I'm excited for. I mentioned, just that kind of silver lining. There's a couple of people who are, just rethinking their career, rethinking their purpose, also repurposing their skills in the culinary world for other people in their community. But I'm really excited to see the curiosity really coming from the audience, coming from people in our own community who are, getting hungry and getting thirsty for these flavors from long time ago, but for flavors that are just like here. They're just in little pockets. They're hiding in grandma and grandpa's cupboards, and they're with elders and even young people in the community. But the flavors and the knowledge is there. So I think there is a certain amount of like awakening that's happening within our own communities, and I think that's the most important part to all of this. I mean, yes, people are creating dishes for a magazine spread, or they are creating $100 pop-up dinners for non-natives mostly. They're getting media attention, but really I think the gist of everything is just sharing all of this knowledge within our own communities, because we're the ones who lost it. We're the ones who cultivated it, and it belongs to us. So I know a lot of people are talking about like, where can we get indigenous food? How can I go to a native restaurant? Where are the native restaurants? I get that question almost daily in my mailbox and in my DMs. but I get them so much that I was inspired to make a whole map of Native American restaurants and a whole list of Native American food owned and operated businesses. So that's there. But then, on top of that, I'm just like, why do we owe you a restaurant? Why do we need to feed you? It's first of all for us. So what was your question again? What was it about? What stories I would like to see told, or?
I feel like you answered the question. I wanted to know what you were most excited about and the stories that you're most excited to tell. And I think that that's a really powerful point in you saying, why do we owe you a restaurant, right? Because there's so often, our stories and the stories of so many people are, how can we package this for an audience? Like when people are trying to diversify, because there's this awakening obviously in storytelling around food this year about how not diverse a lot of major food magazines and publications are. And I think that that's really powerful, rather than saying, well, how can we package this story for an audience that we presume to be mostly affluent and white, and instead put the storytelling in the hands of the working people who are doing it, of the people who are stewarding the land, of the people who are passing traditions down and teaching each other skills. And they are enriching their own community. And that's more than enough. It doesn't have to, it doesn't have to be a restaurant, a Michelin star restaurant for anyone,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and the stories I really like to hear, and what I really try to push with my podcast, are just the diversity within Native America. I mean, there are 574 federally recognized tribes. There are even there are a couple hundred more unrecognized tribes, and even before all of that, there were thousands of tribes. Some didn't make it, some are not here today, but every tribe has its own food culture, and every region is just so different. My desert is not the same as you guys' East Coast. It's not. So all those food stories are different. And I know mainstream media kind of latches on to 4 or 5 guys that they like to highlight in their food media, but there are women, there are young and old, all over in every region, who are specializing in their food, who are maybe they only specialize in their own tribe's food, and that's what they're pushing, and that's what they're revitalizing, and that's all they focus on, you know. So it's vastly different. So that's one thing that I would really love to see more of in just food media, is more diversity. And you know, get some other tribes in there. I mean, I've spoken to people from, you know, hundreds of tribes. Most people, they will only speak to one person from one tribe. So, you know, there are a lot more of us out there, you guys.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that with your podcast and with a lot of the work that everyone on this panel does, it centers the, you know, instead of going out, instead of parachuting into a community, you are telling the stories of your own multitudes of community and the many different groups of people and traditions that exist in those worlds. And something that I would love to pick your brains about, since this is a storytelling panel, is if I could just get a bite-sized story from each of you, just a quick story about a food or a land stewarding moment that really sticks with you, that's really important to you. Kind of an opportunity for you to tell a story that's important to you. And so whoever wants to go first can start.
I can go first. Yeah, so food, just like once I was asked to do this panel, and just like as we were like kind of discussing what you know it was going to be about, and just kind of what we might like to share. I, as I said earlier, I've been trying to find the ways to tie like what I've learned about like eating mostly plant-based and with like things that like dishes or just meals that either like or maybe not culturally specific, just like that my mom grew up making for me, but yes, trying to find ways to create vegan versions of things that are typically found in like Guatemalan, Salvadoran cuisines, as well as Haitian cuisines. Haitian cuisine, I haven't quite gotten there yet. That's going to be a tricky one to make vegan. There's a few things that are inherently vegan, but like very much based in meat and seafood, which speaks, as Zaheer was saying earlier, like food, we learn so much about cultures through food, and like geographically, just like what is available to you, and like how did you know each culture learn how to work with what was around them. So in you know in Haitian cuisine, it's very much you know surrounded by water, so of course there's going to be so much seafood, and just using it in such beautiful and dynamic ways. But for me, one of my like a very recent food memory, but just like one of the most emotional reactions I've had to food. I get very emotional about food. Like if I eat something good, I will start crying. Like I've literally started crying at a restaurant, like eating like a scoop of like lemon mousse, and I'm like, oh my God, my life is forever changed. So I got lots of those stories. They're not really worth the time, but it's quite common for me to start crying over food. But I recently made pupusas for the first time by myself, which is found in a lot of Central Southern American cultures, and it's called different things in different places, and is filled with different things in different places. But for anyone that doesn't know, pupusas are like it's corn flour. They're quite simple to make. It's like usually corn flour, salt, and water, and you make like a kind of like a thick, almost pasty kind of dough, and then you make a filling to go inside. You could do meat, you could do cheese, you could do beans, you can do really anything, which is exciting. I love anything that you can put a filling into, because it's just very much like choose your own adventure. But so I was making some pupusas for the first time. I made them completely vegan, which the dough automatically is. And then I think I was just making like bean and like soy chorizo ones. And I was just like, I was getting really, sometimes I get frustrated and pent up when I'm in the kitchen. And I was having one of those times just because like I felt like I wasn't doing the dough right. I wasn't sure. The only time I had ever made pupusas was with my grandma and my mom before my grandma had a stroke. And she was no longer the like main cook of the house, which was very, again, back to gender roles, especially like matriarchal cooking and stuff like that. Like that is just like a whole thing. But yeah, so making those for the first time by myself, like, and the only other time I had made them was with my grandma, who I hadn't seen for so long before she passed. And like feeling this strain and this distance from blood family and things like that. And then just having this moment when I was making them, I was getting so frustrated. I was like, I'm not doing this right. And just literally just feeling, it wasn't so much that I heard my grandmother's voice, but there was almost like my own voice in my head would be like, just add a little bit more dough. Like stop being, just add a little bit more dough. Like you're being a baby. Like don't lose your cool. Like don't cry over spilt milk. And just like almost like this voice communicating through me that was certainly coming from somewhere else of being like, hey, like, you know what you're doing. Like, you know how to do this. This is in your blood. You know how to do this. Like, just like this thing speaking through me, and it automatically I was calm. And then like I had a blast making the rest of them because it just like felt instinctual. Like I'd never made them before by myself and I was freaking out about it. And then like just like this calm washed over me and I was like talking myself through, but it just very much did feel like my grandmother was talking to me, and like I just started bawling, like making the rest of them, and I was so happy while I was eating them. So that's my story. That was very special because I don't always have moments like that. So that meant a lot to me, and it's always there when I'm making specifically pupusas now. So I hope to find that with other dishes and with other people from my family, and never know who's going to start talking to you. So it's really a very exciting prospect of food for me.
I think I can jump in. Something that of that story reminded me. Mine is around apple pie, which sounds very, very plain, as American as apple pie. Saying your favorite dessert is apple pie is like saying your favorite ice cream is vanilla. Even though they go well together, right? Like that's, but what's interesting, and I grew up just loving apple pie and my mom always made it. And I didn't realize until I was older, my family's from Trinidad and apples are not native to that island, right? But they're imported in the holidays. And so they're very rare and they're considered very exotic and expensive. And so to be able to have apples in your house when they were growing up was like a big deal. And to be able to make apple pie was even a bigger deal, right? Because you're dealing with expensive, rare ingredients. You're dealing with a complex construction in terms of the pastry. You need to use European butter, all those kinds of things, right? And so one of the things that I kind of took away from that aspect of the story is that, what we think of as sort of plain might be exotic in another context. And so that the essential, even though these foods carry stories, we shouldn't essentialize those stories, right? Because they can have a completely different meaning in a different setting. And then the last thing about apple pie. So I've been trying to make apple pie ever since I was, could try. And I think that it's the value in having to try to work on complex dishes. Listening to Tatiana's story about the pupusa is that my attempts, my apple pies are just, they have structural issues. But the repeated attempts at making the pie causes me to go back to or call my mom, and it's just like, what? So there's, those complex dishes isn't just like a one-time intergenerational continuity or connection or transmission. It's like you always have to keep going back. You always have to keep asking. And I really kind of like that. So I'm completely fine if I never perfect the apple pie, if it keeps me making that connection over and over and over again.
I could go next. So kind of like you, Tati, when I have something really good, it's either like tears or like a curse word that comes out. um, and just bringing it up anytime I can. Like we'll be in a editorial meeting for Native America Calling, and I'll just be like, hold on, stop. I gotta talk to you about this mashed potatoes that I had 2 weeks ago. So one story that I've told a couple of folks about, folks who have interviewed me. It's kind of weird being on the other side now, like me being interviewed by somebody else when for so long, for a decade, I've just been on the other side. See, I can't even, like, I'm still just standing here taking notes, listening to you guys, because I can't break that habit of being a journalist. But I've told this story a couple of times, and each time I started crying. So I'm not going to cry now. I'm trying not to. But this was about a decade ago. It was the first time I ever had Afghan food. So this story is not about indigenous food, it's about Afghan food. And around that time, America kind of goes through this cycle of hating different people. We hate queer people for a year. Next, we'll hate Mexicans. Then we'll hate Middle Eastern. So we were in a we hate Middle Easterners cycle in America about a decade ago. And about that time, I met my ex-boyfriend at the time, and I could tell he was, about shy about telling me about who he was because everybody's hating on him and his people. So, finally learned about who he was, and that just like changed my mind about Afghan people because I never had. I was in college at the time, never had friends from the Middle East, just kind of stayed in my little native group. But anyway, so I met this guy, then eventually got to have like a full Friday night Afghan dinner, like the whole spread. I had that for the first time, and eating it, everything was just so delicious. Everything, like the rice, the kormas, the grilled meat, the simple salad, the yogurt, the bread, all of that was just like mind blowing, like literally mind blowing. I just like didn't say anything. I was just like eating, and his mom was just like feeding me, like feeding me. And I didn't say no to anything. So, having that full meal and then reflecting on it later, about a week later, I was like, man, that was so good. Everything was so good. And I just wanted to learn more about Afghan food. And that's, that also just like sparked this whole interest and love of food in me. So from there, like, I really needed to start learning about everybody else. I really needed to start learning about my boyfriend and where he comes from. And get behind all of this nonsense that all of this hate that is just so regular in America, and to really like pay attention to actual families. His mom and his family was so nice to me, and that's the only thing I miss about that relationship. But but that was just like sparked this whole love of food in me, and I've made a career out of it, and eventually it sparked my interest in my own indigenous food, because from that day I had that dinner and that kind of like epiphany. I wanted to learn what was behind a plate of food, what was behind, those ingredients, and the culture that it comes from, not just being an eater and a consumer, but really like making a connection. I know us in the culinary world, we talk about telling stories with food and making connections with food. Well, if you've ever like really had that kind of connection, it'll like make you very emotional, and just like it's hard to hate somebody once you taste their food. It's hard to not be curious about them once you've just had that epiphany on a plate. So I take that understanding with me when I eat anything, really, when I talk to anybody about food. And I hope everybody else can have some kind of connection like that and understand what us foodies talk about when we're saying, telling stories and understanding people through food, because I had that epiphany that long time ago, and it's like changed my life, really. So that's that.
Wow. So I think like I got a question in the chat that was like, what are some like central Jewish seeds? And it's like, and it kind of plays into how I want to respond to this question, which is that one of the central Jewish seeds is wheat. So some of the most ancient, the two mother grains of all modern wheats can be traced back to the Levant, to like the Israel-Palestine region of the world. And there is so much in our culture that is like built around around wheat. So when we think about the things that we can't do on Shabbat, the first melachot, the first things that we can't do in the list of things that we can't do on Shabbat, which I think like the things that we are liberated from, are all of the actions that go into making bread. And when we count the days between two of our main harvest festivals, from the festival of Pesach, of Passover, to Shavuot, we are counting each day as, it's called counting the Omer, it's counting a sheaf of grain. And we're praying in that moment to sort of in this place, coming from this place that is like very deserty. And usually we're like praying for rain. In that moment, we're like, please send us rains in the right amount, in the right time, meaning please not right now, so that we can harvest our grains when they're dry. And so there's like so much that revolves around wheat in our culture. And one of the main, a big point for me of like re-entry into like being an engaged Jew. I grew up Orthodox, I had a fall away, I came back. It's a classic story. But was when I was 18 and I first started working on farms, I had all this food available. I had all these like amazing sweet potatoes specifically. And I was like, I want to do something with this. And I was like, I want to make dinner and I'm going to do it on Friday night and it's going to be Shabbat. And if I'm doing Shabbat, then I have to make challah. And so I started baking bread. And there's, I have this teacher, her name is Ellie Ragosa, and she kind of traveled the world searching for mother grains, searching for the mother wheats. And she did tons of research. And when she speaks about wheat, she shares this piece from the Ethics of Avot de Rabbi Natan, from this guy, Rabbi Natan. And he talks about how a person who buys bread from the market, it is as though they are a child who is like cut from their mother's breast. And like, it really, like, when she was talking about it, she was crying, I was crying, it was like a whole big thing. And it was like this really deep moment of like, wow, like bread, wheat, these grains are so central to our people. And I think about the action of like making bread, like when you go from like, so you're like growing tomatoes, great. You like grow the tomatoes, you pick the tomato, you put it in your mouth, right? You're growing wheat. There's so much you have to do to get there, right? There are so many steps. And when you're kneading the bread, you are putting your physical energy into this thing. You take out like all of your like surus, all of like your whatever from the wheat, you gotta like get it out, and you're just pushing it and pushing it and pushing it into this bread. And then it rises. And it fills up with air and it fills up with love. And when you braid it, you're braiding it because it's a remnant of the first loving, in our cosmology story, the first loving interaction on earth was when Eve was presented to Adam. And there's this like midrash, there's this story that God braided Eve's hair. And so we have this braid, we have this like remnant of that first loving look on our table. And yeah, wheat, it's crazy. And side note, I now don't even eat gluten. And so I like used to sell flour for my friend who's a miller at the farmer's market. I bake challah, I bake wheat bread every week. I don't eat it. It's not even about the eating anymore. It's just about that process of like connecting with these grains and meeting the divine in the act of creation, because we have to put so much of ourselves into it. So that's my little food story.
That's beautiful. All of these stories are making me feel a lot of feelings, but we're coming to our close today. And just very quickly, I wanted to ask if you could, Zaheer, talk about your upcoming work with storytelling.
Okay, that's kind of I was not expecting that, but yeah, I've started a project called Make It Plain: Storytelling and Listening for Social Change, which centers listening as a means of acquiring historical information, as a means of creating opportunities for intergenerational transmission of wisdom and knowledge, and of course, as a means of nurturing community capacity. And so the work will be focused around the oral histories of African American Muslim communities and the ways that these communities created their understandings of justice by interacting with, of course, the US justice system. So it's a project I'll be working on that's both an oral history project, but most importantly and meaningful for me, a community-based oral history project that's designed to increase the community's capacity at historical archiving and preservation.
Thank you. I figured that that was a good tie-in to the work of the Storytelling and Social Change panel. Just super quickly, I would love for each of you to share where people can find you after this lovely panel is over.
I'll go first because it's yeah, if you want to find me, and I can put it in the chat. As of right now, as I said, I deactivated my main Instagram page this week, and I'm gonna try to keep that going for a while because I needed that break. But my cooking page, Kitchen Witch Bitch, is still active on Instagram. It's just at Kitchen Witch Bitch as it's spelled in my little name box there. But yeah, I can put that in there. And then if you'd like to listen to my music moniker is a Childlike Empress, and that's around, and that's a whole other type of storytelling. But yeah, hoping to get like an actual proper website going soon. That'd be great to share, more thoughts and stories about cooking as well as recipes, and hopefully soon actually getting some proper like skincare and like healthcare stuff going that I make in my kitchen. So yeah.
I could go next.
Yeah.
So you can find Toasted Sister, the website, toastedsisterpodcast.com. You can find it on Instagram at Toasted Sister. And then you can find me on Instagram at Andi Murphy 13. And of course on all over Facebook. And I'm at Andi Murphy on Twitter. And definitely subscribe to Toasted Sister anywhere you listen to podcasts. And I've got a bunch of I've got a bunch of like episodes just like all up in the air and just collecting audio for each of them, and I'm gonna be editing together maybe 2 or 3 episodes for November, so stay tuned.
Thank you.
You can find us at jewishfarmernetwork.org. I put it in the chat. And if you're interested in like finding out about cool things happening, both like offerings from the Jewish Farmer Network and also from beyond, you can subscribe to our newsletter. And we are at Jewish Farmer Network on Instagram. You can find us on Facebook. And yeah, that's it.
I also put, sorry, go ahead, Andi.
Okay, sorry. Native America Calling. NativeAmericaCalling.com is where you find all of my work there. I mean, we do 250 plus episodes every year. So if you want to find out anything about Native Americans, we've pretty much done a show about that. So like dinosaurs and food and fishing rights, hunting rights, everything you can think of. And we're still developing even more for for episodes to come. So if you're interested about learning about Native issues and topics, Native America Calling is a good place to go.
And I also put all mine in the chat: Twitter at Zaheer Ali, Instagram at _Zaheer Ali, and my website is zaheerali.com.
I can't express my gratitude enough to all of you for speaking today. I think this has been such a lovely conversation. And thank you, everyone who watched. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. I'm really excited to introduce our closing guest, Lou Leonard, who is the Dean of Chatham University's Folk School of Sustainability and the Environment, who will send us off from our 2-day learning event, Food in Uncertain Times. Thank you so much.